give some context, for quite a while now, I've not been struggling with Aphalas Lore in terms of the actual creation side of things. I've had so many different ideas spiraling out, but the problem is actually where I started in the world building, because I started at a key event that does actually relate to the books as well. And it has some significant aspects for all of Aphalas where I started. But the problem is that it wasn't at the point, like, I didn't start at the creation of the peoples or the founding of the first kingdoms or stuff like that. I actually started near the destruction of some things instead. And with all of these other ideas, and as well as the actual creation of Arasin, the Archipelago, Onarchivorous, and even Galakaros, it changed things up. It created new dynamics and new elements of this big question of, whilst all of this was going on with these original lore aspects that pretty much covered only this section of the world, what was going on in these other continents. And then I started coming up with ideas, but then it was working on, okay, how do these ideas correlate with what's going on elsewhere? How come there's such a disconnect? That's where things like the Ruby Mist and eventually the A-Gate barrier come into it. Notably though, and something that has run into my mind a few times, is that whilst it's distant, the archipelago actually has no barrier around it. So anyone can freely travel there as they please. But it was with this in mind that all of these different ideas started coming out, and then trying to work out which ones came before what I've done already in the lore, which ones came after, which ones fell in the middle, what could work, what wouldn't. And then randomly last night, and I do quite literally mean last night, I had just after working on it for a while with actually the story event, which I will be covering later in the stream, we're briefly going over, but largely focusing around not only the Dracons, but also the Aphalas D&D characters. And I know that is something I did not do on stream, but there were a group of us from the KGL, and we banded together and we're doing an Aphalas D&D, and it kind of got left on a hiatus, an indefinite one, but the story continued as it was always intended to be lore friendly. It was just a different and stylish way of just adding in some more lore creation. And I didn't want that campaign to just be the end of those characters either, so that was a key concept, and that actually fell into a problem because I had to change around the date in which that campaign took place. Otherwise, well, at the very least, a couple of the characters would, have already aged beyond the point of living. But keeping with this mentality and the focus, and also I do apologise that the stream's not got any background music for this. I did look into it, but for some reason it wasn't playing on OBS, so I'm gonna leave that for the edits. And this, just to get the sidetracking out of the way before going back to it, this is essentially going to be a stream filled with lore works and stories that all interconnect, but it's also going to serve as like batch recording for me, instead of using up and eating into all of this time. And then for the different elements, I can focus that on the editing as well. So that's this experiment. But yeah, going back to it, and I'm trying really hard not to tab out, but I'm going to have to because people are steaming me. Right. So this whole aspect finally got figured out, and it revolves around 3 key characters at the point of it. And this is the first lengthy period of stories that I'm actually focusing on that actually occur before Tonreef, which is actually kind of exciting. Going to have to step out for a moment. Pebble, what's going on? What's the wheel done? What did it pick you? Pebble? You were only meant to put the ones you wanted to pick between in it, not all of them. I mean, you can be a brawler if you want to be. Right. Back on track. We were working out something else. So yes, this whole arc of stories and everything revolved primarily around 3 characters, and to various extents they're all working behind the scenes. It's like a 3-pronged chess match in some ways, and I don't actually have images for 2 of them, sadly, or yet, that is, but I can bring up the image for one of them. If you just give me a memento. So, this is Bekaquin. She is a Talamarith human. We'll hover her over Tartak for now. The Talamarith, obviously, coming from this area here. But she is a part of a bloodline that has a specific power, and it is a power of a type of foresight. She is able to conjure up images of a potential future, and whilst this may seem like a bit of a random thing to randomly throw into the lore just like that, it's not actually the first instance of this in the lore of the world building. The mirages that appear and have more tragic pasts actually also have a form of visions and things like that, so that's not, and it's all based around the sort of ruby magic at the face of it with illusionary stuff. But she is, her chosen path and talent to be able to do this is through paint. It's how she's able to conjure it up and focus it. But as soon as these talents became known, and she had been a secret weapon of Talamarith to try and help them for quite a while, she ended up actually being forced out and having to go into refuge, and she takes refuge with the trolls of Talansa. One of the, still arguably the safest places, despite their constant attacks with the forces from Shah. But the story focuses around, or the set of stories, because it's not just one story, it's almost like it's a saga in itself. She is one aspect of it, and then there are two other aspects. There is Rorne the Stormcast, who does not have an image yet, but what you need to know about him is three key elements. He is the fifth Cunroke, the one who is basically the forebear before Tonreef. He is the only sea elf to ever actually become a Cunroke, and he is also a Feldspar enchanter. So he focuses around his efforts largely around the sea and navigation and those kind of conflicts for a lot, and he's able to manipulate nature with his magic, meaning he's an incredibly lethal opponent. And I know I haven't actually gone into detail about the other Cunrokes so far, but I am already of the mindset that Rorne may very well be the most powerful of all of them, even more than Tonreef, because whilst Tonreef is strong, a lot of his power is actually augmented, not only by his skill as a corruptor, but also the actual items and power that the Cunroke gathers. But Rorne is also a very dutiful one. He's got a lot of his own mentalities, and I'll actually remove Bekaquin's image for a moment because it's not fully relevant to this point. That's the wrong image. I could just remove the background. But he is the other aspect, and he is evidently the main antagonist of this saga of stories and sects. And I did say sects, just saying, with a T. But the other element of it is a new introduction into the lore, and one that I am purposely keeping very close to the chest in terms of ideas. And that's the Indigo Foxes. And they are almost like a more mysterious and controversial, in some cases, in their actions, form of the Eyes of the Father. And just as a reminder, the Eyes of the Father were a part of the Thornreth, who now reside pretty much only on Arisen, and they are based around lynxes, but they serve as guides, and that's what the Indigo Foxes do. But whilst the lynx serve as guides as a safety measure or everything, the Indigo Foxes have other intentions with theirs. Please tell me that's not being picked up by the mic. Okay. The clear aspects and everything is that obviously I just said about the links, but the Indigo Foxes, when they guide, they're doing it for an ulterior motive. They've got their own plan, they have their own movements that they keep in mind. And this is what brings us into the title of this bit, and that's the Origin of the Vampires. The Origin of the Vampires actually starts, or what leads to their origin, starts on Gallicaros. But not Gallicaros in the terms of when Senetvia was there, or in terms of when the goblins were there, but when it was still occupied by the elves. around Kalarath, you had the Beast Elves, you had the Sea Elves operating off the coast, and then in Haraketh you had the Stone Elves. The Stone Elves are the first people in all of Aphalas to nearly be completely wiped out. They get stuck. They get stuck in a lot of different conflicts throughout between themselves and primarily the Beast Elves, so it's an internal elven combat. And there's a lot of pushing, there's a lot of battles, but eventually it gets proven that they just cannot stand against the Beast Elves and their forces, even with support from goblins, dragons, their own Sea Elves who are kind of fractured in all of this, and even the trolls. So they end up reciting and using a rare ability that they had developed, which is technically a form of feldspar magic, but largely focused around one element, and that's stone bending. And they encase themselves in a tomb with a specific summoning spell that bounds them to stone and lives on, essentially inspiration from things like the Terracotta Army. But there was and for a while in the lore that was all that happened to them, and they were just sitting and waiting in the depths of Galakaros. But there was actually one leader and his small group of stone elves that escaped, and he is known as the Lost Prince. Again, don't have an image yet, but they flee into the earth, they seal it off and start carving out ways to live in the subterranean areas of Aphalas that they're able to, and meaning that a lot of their land is technically also under the ocean. But they get and for a while it's just them, for quite some time actually. But then upon the finding of the humans, shortly after that something happens and an Indigo Fox appears. They were stories of only myth and legend, and obviously being isolated to the subterranean, no one would have really heard tales of these, but they ended up following. And the fox takes them all the way to Arisen. Don't know why I looked up there, I could have just gone down. But they come across a set of the Zertian humans, if I remember correctly, is the Nerok, who I think I was going to change the name of. But upon finding them, they discover and actually aid and rescue their queen and multiple humans, and they bound together, and this gathers some trust, and the stone elves start to believe that the fox leads to their best intention. It later comes across that upon the severing of Arisen, the thing that initially destroyed the original dwarven lands of Arrow Downir, I believe, with Tal Balinir, Zebulkhan and other areas like the Gulf of Rorlock, it's actually the dwarves within who actually lived on the plains of the Salbonorth at the time, who again get aided and rescued, and this is the form that these stone elves still at this point now take. Stone elves, humans, dwarves, they work together, they form together, they start constructing these great places. But then something started to dwell on the Last Prince, and that was the whole concept of they're not going to live forever. And with that in mind, they started making movements to ensure that they could, and not just them, but also their followers. And again, the fox appears and guides them, and there are more than one fox. It's just there's unaccounted how many. And this one actually leads them to learning the text, and it actually, in a bit of a controversial method, actually leads to a raid on the Narracon Inn here, and they steal several obsidian texts specifically, and melded with their stone bending and other things like blood ritual and stuff, they're able to essentially create a kind of elixir, and they go through with it, they drink it, and they become effectively become the first of Aphalas's vampires, because whilst they obtain a new rejuvenation of almost immortality, they also start to gather more elements. They feel the direct linking of the obsidian into their blood, basically changing and manifesting them, and it gives them the limited power to convert others. It allows them to have some command over the dead, or at least some resistance to it. And yeah, they also, some of their darker sects also lead into the aspects of, you know, blood drinking and stuff like that. But in this measure, and at this point, the Last Prince and the Lost Queen find comfort with each other, and things happen. Trying to keep it PG friendly. But they, after I just talked about drinking blood, but yeah. They have multiple children, and the subterranean force starts to properly grow and cast forth, and the humans and the other stone elves also start forming together. But this is where a bit of a different aspect comes in. Some of the stone elves actually look at all of this and start turning against it, as do most of the dwarves, and they attempt to rebel, but the rebellion goes absolutely horribly wrong, and some of them escape and start forming a bit of their own sect. Not really a resistance, or it starts off as one, but eventually they do find peace. But more so, the others just get subjugated effectively and turned into the workforce of the peoples. The origin of the vampires, though, is incredibly important, not just because of the life it gives to the subterranean stuff, but also what happens beyond. Because this is a force of essentially immortals, with the servants who aren't necessarily immortal, but there might be some aspects. There's still a lot to cover with them. But this is where it turns back to the actual main, or one of the main antagonists of all of Aphalas, Nagrasak. There was 2 Kunrokes that happened in fairly quick succession, and they were both goblins, and effectively what happened is the first tried to rebel and ended up being hunted down and slain by the new one. And the new one did attempt initial movements and combats, but he was actually the leader, in which the Last Prince and the vampires actually revealed themselves to other peoples in the world, starting to learn of their existence or some idea of it. And stuff happens with that goblin, and then a long time passes before Rorne comes into it. Rorne does become the Kunroke, and early on he's just accomplishing tasks and everything, but his first true real mission is to actually engage the Lost Prince's forces in this subterranean effort, partly to grow his own power and deal with an enemy, whilst Nagrasak also wanted to keep the fact that he had gathered a new Kunroke quiet, as Rorne was the first one in several hundred years. And bear in mind that the Last Prince can still survive not only because of the elven blood, but also because has a form of immortality now. The Last Prince and Rorne end up engaging, and in this chaos and this mess, one of the prince's children does actually get kidnapped, and in a path of vengeance and everything, the prince launches forth a massive attack and actually very nearly kills Rorne, and it's an entire incident that is worthy of probably its own story later on when the details are more established. But that calls for a sort of back and forth where the forces kind of clash and they just end up in this sort of internal tug of war with no side really making any progress. Basically down to just a year and year on skirmish. And for a while, that is effectively what occurs. But that is this aspect, the vampires and their role. So now we will actually change it and move on to the next group who need to be discussed.